Good evening. Hi. Good evening. I just want to remind everybody of two things. One, that a reception follows this reading in the spa in the basement of Case College Center. That's one thing. And then if you haven't turned off your cell phones, we would be very happy if you would do that. Thank you very much. All right. In this evening's reading, Joanna Scott will introduce Cass Phillips, and Rosanna Warren will introduce Louise Gluck. Joanna Scott.
I'm not doing it. I'm just introducing. I am delighted to introduce Cass Phillips. A musicologist named Philip Husker, writing about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, tells us there's probably no more impressive storm in all music. The whole orchestra surges and shakes, trombones appear to emphasize the downpour, and the timpani slows up just to add the thunder. But Husker reminds us that the storm doesn't last, the clouds finally roll away, the oboe promises better things to come in a wonderfully heartfelt phrase, and the flute, with its staccato scale, raises the curtain on Elysium. In an interview in the esteemed American literary journal Salmagundi, Cass Phillips reported that he can whistle the whole of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. I know every single moment, he said, offering this fact to illustrate his passionate interest in artistic form. Fiction succeeds when its very form creates a thrust of meaning. Like Beethoven's symphony, fictional narrative needs to keep its theme in motion. In Phillips' words, you keep going forward, but remind us where we've been. There is a viable parabola, and it rises and it falls away gently to a conclusion. In Phillips' hands, we can be sure that the story will keep pressing forward even as the past stays visible. His ability to create sharply cinematic scenes through precise details and dialogue packed with implication would be an achievement for any writer. For Cass Phillips, any dramatic rendering of experience is just the starting point, to be enriched with a fluid twisting between past and present. With his fictional designs, Phillips makes us see that the progressions of life and the returns of memory are inextricably connected and can occur within the same scene, even within the same moment. Transgression is the key here. Phillips keeps us thinking about transgression both as an aesthetic option and an emotional force. Any idea, personal or cultural, that presents itself as inflexible is his target. In his rendering, identity is not a definition we can look up in a dictionary. It is as fluid as his narratives, as persistent and unpredictable. In a tour de force passage in Cass's novel In the Falling Snow, a father tells his son how to fight back against a society that aims to demean him. In a speech that is initially reminiscent of the grandfather's dying words in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Cass's character angrily counsels his son, "Look upon their foolishness like a game you winning, and the stupid people don't even know that you busy scoring points off their ignorance." But instead of being offered as the final word, this advice is only the beginning for this character, who goes on with breathless urgency to tell his son the story of his life, a life marked by tragedies the son is only hearing about for the first time. The story encapsulates within the final chapter the entire novel's concerns, culminating in crystalline awareness of the difficulties he faced. It seems like every time I think I discover some peace of mind, then something else comes along to trouble my head. Remembering his fears about providing for his family in such an unaccepting society, the father relives his past. "I'm looking at you lying so still and peaceful," he remembers. "I want to bang my head on the wall because I just don't have any idea how to go forward with my life." In telling of his life, he does go forward. He may be angry and disappointed. He may not have found the success he dreamed of, but at the end of the novel, he succeeds in conveying to his son the truth about his past. The story, then, becomes his great act of transgression. Though England was cruel to him when he was a young immigrant, he determines how he will be remembered. A projectile under the influence of gravity ideally follows the curve of a parabola. A character in the hands of Cas Phillips is propelled by the forces of desire, fury, rebellion, bursting across a reality that is relentlessly harsh. Follow the Broadway headliner Bert Williams through Cas's novel Dancing in the Dark. Watch him play the part of a clown to entertain his white audience. Detroit, 1896, Cas writes, beckoning us to keep up with Bert as he tries out a new disguise. The first time he looked at himself in the mirror, he thought of the embarrassment and distress that this would cause his father, and his heart sank down through his body like a stone, down toward those long, oversized boots that announced him as clown. How could a West Indian do such a thing to himself? We see Bert sinking beneath the weight of prejudice. We hear him express his shame. It's a shocking moment, quietly violent, terribly solitary, but Bert is too supple and clever to let himself be defeated here. As I apply the burnt coke to my face, as I smear the black into my already sable skin, as I put on my lips, I am leaving behind Egbert Austin Williams, he tells himself. His strength keeps him aloft. He will only pretend to disappear behind the mask of humiliation. After every performance, he vows to reclaim himself. Phillips writes, every night he would have to rediscover himself before he left the theater. Critics use words like compassionate, mournful, poignant, vivid to describe Cas Phillips' work. They also use words like ferocious and uncanny. I don't know of any other contemporary writer who so fiercely and poignantly illustrates the strength required to live in this embattled world. The parabolic fiction of Cas Phillips moves with a projectile's force and the grace of a symphony. He is a writer who extends our awareness of human potential, and we are lucky to welcome here tonight. Thank you.
Joanna, I'm just going to sit down now. Thank you. That was wonderful. Very kind. And thank you. Is that better? Not yet. That's better. Tell me, Bob, is that better? Okay. And thank you, Bob and Peg, for inviting me back again to the Writers' Workshop at Skidmore. I appreciate the invitation, but I also appreciate the chance to bond with the familiar cast of characters. I'll say no more. I'm going to read tonight from a novel that I've been moaning about for the last 4 hours that I'm copy editing at the moment, called The Lost Child, which will be published next year. It has a front story, if you like, a main narrative, which is about a woman in the 1950s who eventually has 2 children and has difficulties bringing them up. And it has a backstory set, of course, in the early 19th century about a father and his 3 daughters. And at some point, the stories, trust me, intersect. So I'll read a short passage from both sections of the novel and then leave it to you next March to figure out whether or not you want to figure out how they intersect. What I will say is that the backstory of the father and the 3 daughters is the girls are called Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. and it's the second name is Bronte. Emily Bronte only left England once, which was to go to Brussels to try and learn French, or improve her French rather, with her sister Charlotte. So I'll read a short section about Emily and Charlotte going to Brussels, and then I'll read from the contemporary section. And far be it from me to deconstruct my own writing, but it seems to me I'm quite interested in fathers and daughters, which is strange because I have no sisters. But there we are. 6 years ago, they left Yorkshire and journeyed south to London before continuing on to Belgium. Two slightly impetuous maiden sisters traveling together, submitting themselves to a heroic adventure in the hope of acquiring an improved proficiency in the French language. They fully understood that they were neither attractive nor fashionable, but they'd been raised to eschew the approval of others. Papa had reluctantly given his blessing, and he hoped that they would watch over each other and safely deliver themselves back to his doorstep. After all, what could he do? Perhaps journeying was in the girl's blood. His own pilgrimage had taken him from the island of his birth to Cambridge, where he'd studied with anxious intensity as a shy and stammering commoner. His transformation from Patrick Bronte to Patrick Bronte fooled no one, and his attempts to scour the Irish brogue from his tongue, and his half-hearted gesture of dressing above his station, provoked ill-suppressed laughter. His awkward demeanour grew more intense and silenced as he became aware that to his contemporaries he was an object of entertainment, and the handful of undergraduates he regarded as potential intimates soon began to avoid the ignominy of being seen in his orbit. The final stage of his own adventure saw him migrate north to Yorkshire, where he felt no inclination to impress any amongst his flock, and where he maintained an aloof and zealously observed distance from the people of Haworth. She stared into the churning waters of the tempest-tossed English Channel and realized that with this moonlit journey she was now traveling beyond her dear father's imagination. The waves lashed the sturdy vessel, and she clung with wet hands to the rail, and she rocked back and forth, allowing herself to be baptized by the haze of briny spray. Charlotte was held securely in the clench of seasickness, and she lay below deck, turning restlessly on her bunk, but she understood that there was little she could do to alleviate her sister's turmoil. Charlotte had dropped and declined hurriedly, but Emily knew that this affliction would soon be resolved after a short, hard conflict that at this stage would benefit little from the commotion of human empathy. Above her, the black sky was choked with stars, the same glorious constellation that jolted her sensibility on her late-night walks beyond the parsonage. She greeted her familiar heavenly companions, and she ignored the cry of yet another crew member who urged the long-legged woman to leave the deck. "Ma'am, please, it will be safer for a lady down below." She offered the terrified young man an upwardly tilted chin and the faintest hint of a smile before presenting him with her willowy back. She was traveling home tonight in the company of a forbidding wind. Through the bleary windows of the carriage, the sisters could see little but flat, ill-manicured land swimming out in all directions, and only the occasional scruffy village disrupted the monotony. After some time, the villages began to embrace one another and form a town. And suddenly the town began to grow into a city. Brussels revealed itself without the fanfare of London's vociferous certitude. A continental city, melancholic in appearance, apologetic in tone, it remorselessly busied itself as though afraid to be discovered slacking. Her sister retained a pallid countenance from the exertions of the crossing, and once again she closed her heavily lidded eyes and allowed her head to loll sideways against the glass. And then Charlotte blinked furiously, as though embarrassed to have been caught in a moment of weakness, and she watched as her diminished sister adjusted her slumped posture and readdressed her attention to the spectacle of the somewhat dreary city they had now entered. "Like a prison," wrote Emily. "Dear Anne, Monsieur Hager's school is like a prison, with its high stone walls and its heavy press of silence. I feel an iron weight constantly anchoring me to the earth. He simply wishes me to imitate the style of others, thus obscuring my own vision. I am 24 years of age, and I see no reason to stoop before the tyranny of this unreasonable man. In this school of learning, I learn nothing except how to retreat into myself and regard the world about me with apathy. I'm stimulated by little except the unwelcome aroma of one tedious day exhaling into the next, and time carries me forward against my will." She informed her fragile sister that her French had improved considerably, so much so that she was able to think and even dream in the language, but Monsieur Hager was almost certainly not the cause of her advancement. She characterized him as a young man who exuded an elaborate sincerity that was ruined by his determination to grin and display his polished teeth. She read constantly, and having made a selection from the books in the small library at the back of the single classroom, she would bustle back to the tiny room that she shared with her traveling companion, and once again she would indulge herself. A freshly rejuvenated Charlotte regularly volunteered for extra lessons with the master, and Emily therefore often enjoyed the sole occupation of their room and was able to fully embrace her moody solitude. Occasionally she would venture forth, and she would stroll in the gardens where she risked encountering her captivated sister, listening eagerly to whatever it was that her master was saying to her, a pair of them oblivious to her ghostly presence. At such moments she made it her business to seek out the shadow of a broad tree that might enable her to linger unobserved. Poor Charlotte, who gazed upon the professor with ill-disguised ardor, was now abandoning the quiet dignity of an inner life for the farce of a fluttering heartbeat in Brussels. On Sundays, they traveled out into the city, and they visited with a family with whom their father had connections, the origins of which were beneath any clear understanding on the part of either sister. However, after a half-dozen Sundays, the visits began to corrode into an obligation, which Charlotte tried desperately to make light of by taking control of the conversational territory. While riding the carriage towards their destination, her sister regularly compiled a list of topics to be discussed, and she rehearsed the order in which the subjects were to be raised. On encountering this tedious continental family, whose cakes and teas they both found unspeakable, it was Charlotte alone who made the effort to rescue the afternoon from catastrophe, whilst Emily retreated into an implacable silence that hinted at shyness, although her blazing eyes invariably betrayed boredom, and her general demeanor suggested that she cared little for anyone else's opinions. Late on Sunday night, the two sisters would prop themselves up in their uncomfortable beds and read their grammars. She frequently stole a look at Charlotte and silently apologized for her behavior. She understood that her well-practiced hostility made it impossible for Charlotte to engage in elegant repartee with their hosts, and the deathly quiet return journey in the lumbering carriage would be interrupted only by Charlotte stirring herself to gently scold her headstrong sister. As daylight began to fade and their journey home continued, she would glance briefly at a discomfited Charlotte, but she would say nothing, which seemed to temporarily satisfy her older sister, who, for some reason, always appeared to be transfixed by the gloomy views of the streets of Brussels through the begrimed windows of their carriage. She stood in the cooling shadow of a spreading beech tree, her back to the pitted bark, her toes steadfastly gripping the soles of her shoes, which in turn marked the grass. The master was once again displaying himself in his carefully pressed suit of clothes and encouraging the overly studious gazing of the young woman who sat obediently next to him. It was clear to all but the besotted that his allure was undermined by his inability to move beyond his charm. He stood and took his leave, playfully lacing his way through a line of trunks and ambling towards the elegantly carved door. He threw a quick final glance in the direction of the bench, a look calculated to cast himself in a kindly light, before nimbly mounting the 3 steps and disappearing into the house where his wife would no doubt be waiting patiently for him. She watched Charlotte lift the plain envelope to her face with both hands and then smell its scent. This man was operating upon her sister with a fully conscious determination. Once again, Charlotte drew the perfumed air to her and allowed it to overwhelm her senses. A fragrance meaning what, exactly? From her concealed location, she observed poor Charlotte drift. It was the week before Christmas, and they were both squeezed together into the back of a post-chaise that was carefully picking its way across the solemn moors in the direction of Haworth. This was a season when the weak light of day simply expired and was quickly swallowed up by a sudden upsurge of blackness. It had been a wearisome journey, and her troubled sister had travelled with a sorrowful, closed heart that she knew would refuse any sentiments of sympathy. To offer solace would be to irritate, and so she'd resigned herself to watching the dispiriting drama of Charlotte's further relinquishing governance over her emotion. Driving rain began to lash down and beat an impatient cadence on the roof of the flimsy box, but mercifully it was now possible to see the beacon light of a solitary candle sputtering in an upstairs window of a far-off inn, and the horses began to trip with renewed enthusiasm. Charlotte, however, remained consumed by her deep melancholy. Her sister's petals had closed in upon themselves. She was returning to Papa as less than what she had been. Okay. '20th century. Toward the end of her second year at university, Monica Johnson listened as her father told her that he'd given the matter a great deal of thought, but sadly he couldn't be expected to tolerate her behavior for a moment longer. He cleared his throat and wondered if he had soft-soaped things by using the word sadly. She was staring at him with those large, unblinking brown eyes of hers and waiting for him to continue, but he'd misjudged things, for he'd anticipated tears. But instead of a torrent of emotion, his 20-year-old daughter continued to scowl and wait for him to explain himself. Being a schoolmaster in one of the most highly considered grammar schools in the north of England, he was, of course, used to making advanced concepts intelligible to young people. However, they both knew that this was a subject upon which there really was no need for him to expand any further. After all, standards were standards. And although it disappointed him to have to take such a stance, Monica knew full well that once he'd made up his mind, that was it. They sat together in her room at the top of a narrow 19th century staircase in the back quad of one of Oxford's smaller and less prestigious women's colleges. Between them, a fully laden tray sat atop a rickety wooden table which rose little more than a foot above the threadbare rug. 2 untouched pieces of Dundee cake decorated a white china plate which was flanked on one side by a bright red teapot and on the other by 2 ill-matching cups stacked one on top of the other. She had thought long and hard about what to wear and had assumed that her father, who had fixed ideas about how women should present themselves, might even be expecting her to be decked out in her tutorial garb, a nice, dark, sensible skirt, dark stockings, and a crisp white blouse. She had chosen instead to wear a sloppy grey pullover and tan slacks, but further confused the issue by tying back her long straight hair with an incongruously cheerful yellow ribbon. Although she knew full well that she wasn't much to look at, this year men had begun to notice her, and even if she couldn't prove it scientifically, she was sure that the more she dressed like a townie, the more attention she received. But she certainly didn't want scrutiny from this warped man, who had already bullied his wife into near-mute submission. By the time Monica was a teenager, she was fairly sure what type of person she was dealing with, and it was she who had decided to cultivate a distance between them, which she closely monitored, carefully increasing the gap with each passing year. Having ushered him into her room and hung his overcoat and his hat on the back of the door, she directed him to a chair that offered a view out onto the sloping attic window, onto the somewhat hideous modern red tiles that crowned the college annex. The 4-hour drive from Wakefield had provided him with the opportunity to reflect and to choose precisely the right words. And once he was seated, he came straight to the point, which he knew would leave ample time for debate, or, if his daughter so wished, time for debate and refreshment. But as she continued to stare at him with that particularly rebellious sneer that she seemed to have cultivated in her teenage years, he began now to question his tactics, and he wondered if he should have taken a cup of tea and a piece of cake before easing his way into the subject. She looked at him, fully aware of the fact that to open her mouth right now would only result in her coming out with angry and resentful words as she bit down hard on her bottom lip. Monica wasn't in the habit of revealing emotional vulnerability to this man, for she knew that the end result of such stupidity was having your wings ripped off. As she tasted the first sting of blood, she reminded herself of her promise to keep things nice and steady. "So, that's it then," she said. "You're washing your hands of me." She swallowed hard, but she didn't take her eyes from him. "Well?" He raised a warning finger. "Now then," he said, "there's no need to take that tone with me." And then he realized how he must appear with his finger dangling foolishly in midair, and so he quickly swiveled his wrist and opened his palm. "I could," he said, "pussyfoot around, but to whose benefit would that be? So, that's it then." He looked at the pot, and he imagined that the tea must now be cold. Why did Monica always have to be so bloody willful? No matter what he did, she always seemed to be set against him. She'd been stubborn as a girl, but nothing out of the ordinary, as far as he could tell, until she started budding. That's when his daughter went from diffident to downright disobedient. One day she was prepared to answer his admittedly tedious questions about what classes she liked best at school, or he should be interested in coming with him to a musical concert at the town hall. And then the next day, it was as though all communication between the two of them had totally broken down. He knew that she liked Wordsworth, so he suggested a walking holiday in the Lake District, just the two of them. But Monica rolled her eyes and said, "No thanks." And then, after she'd been accepted at university, when he made it clear that he'd love to motor down and explore the place with her, she just laughed and carried on watching a program on the television that they'd newly purchased. "Well," she said, breaking off a piece of Dundee cake with her fingers, "is that all you've got to say to me?" He wanted to smack the girl, but it was too late for this. As much as her tone was entirely unacceptable, as usual, her tone was entirely unacceptable, but he knew enough about young people to understand that he had to continue to exude assertiveness and control, and so he climbed to his feet. "So it would appear, Monica, so it would appear. You know, I've no desire to fight with you." He paused, and for a moment their eyes locked. "Listen, I'd best be off before the traffic starts building, and Monica, you know, I'm sorry." His daughter heard his bumbling apology, but she said nothing, and simply unhooked his overcoat and then his hat and handed them to him. He looked at his child, but for him to say anything further would involve stepping too far outside of himself, and so he simply offered her a weak smile. Then he caught a glimpse of himself in the small mirror on the wall to the side of the door, and he realized that this afternoon's effort had put 5 years on him. As she picked up a small bunch of keys, Monica broke off another portion of cake. "I'll show you the way out of the college." They crossed the quiet, shadowy quadrangle, and then edged their way through a narrow archway and out into the sunlit brightness of the front quad, where two clusters of students shared the lawn, playing separate games of croquet in neighborly proximity to each other. As they walked together, he felt a momentary surge of panic, knowing that this final act of his performance would be improvised. They stepped through the huge wooden door and out into the street, and then he stopped, and he gently held Monica's arm through a handful of grey jumper. "You will keep in touch, won't you?" His daughter looked up at him, but said nothing. He let go of Monica's arm, and he fished in his jacket pocket for his car keys. "I'm parked just down the road, around the corner. There's no need for you to trouble yourself. I can find my own way." Why, he wondered, couldn't he add love? "I can find my own way, love." But he knew that it wouldn't do to confuse her. Once he turned the corner and passed out of sight, he took a handkerchief from his pocket, and he discreetly blew his nose, and then he dabbed at his eyes. Mission accomplished. Thank you.
The appearance last year of Louise Gluck's collection of her poems of 50 years
Poems 1962-2012, marked a triumph, but not by a long shot, a complete or even a collected poems. From book to book, through the 12 individual volumes she has brought out so far, Gluck has maintained a paradoxical consistency in creating a new imaginative world each time. And tonight we will hear her read, I think, not from the past, but from a present so fresh it still tastes like the future. Poems from her new book, Faithful and Virtuous Night, N-I-G-H-T, to be published next September by Farrar Straus. In her first book, Firstborn, Gluck startled readers with her acid concentrations of appetite, revulsion, grief, and rage, a language that seemed boiled down to its essence. You live in me, malignant. Love, you ever want me, don't. From the poem Hesitate to Call. In volume after volume thereafter, she widened her spiritual and imaginative scope, keeping her language always honed, an instrument for a dire insistence on knowledge. Adam and Eve have haunted her poems. Here's a bit from Palais des Arts in Descending Figure. She can't touch his arm in innocence again. They have to give that up and begin as male and female, thrust and ache. Her poems have often borne witness to a search for Gnostic perfection, a separation of soul from body, and at the same time to a fierce lucidity about the consequences of that romance. Her voice, it is the same need to perfect, of which death is the mere byproduct. From the poem, Dedication to Hunger. These poems are never self-centered. Their linguistic discipline saves them from that, as does their frequent adoption of wildly differing personae and points of view, a constant testing of claims about truth and feeling, truth of feeling. The Wild Iris, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, dramatizes the voices of Adam and Eve, various flowers and trees, and God, who speaks through weather conditions. In Meadowlands, a contemporary divorce is seen through the Odyssey in the voices of Odysseus, Penelope, and especially the caustic son, Telemachus. In A Village Life, Gluck invented a whole imaginary town, vaguely Italian, somewhat resembling the unforgiving, stark, rural world of Cesare Pavese's Lavorare stanca, hard labor. As I have pondered over the years how Gluck manages her feats of impersonation and sibylline utterance, I've come to feel that it has a great deal to do with her mastery of tone. She maintains an eerie balance between wit and sorrow, between cold detachment and open-heartedness. And in her hands, any simple observation can spring into allegory or parable, as in this glimpse of a card game in the poem Widows from Ararat. My aunt's been at it longer. Maybe that's why she's playing better. Her cards evaporate. That's what you want. That's the object. In the end, the one who has nothing wins. I love that poem. But there are more than human situations in these poems. Her worlds are keenly attuned to the wheeling seasons, to cosmic mysteries, to the gods who might walk among us. In a magnificent poem from her new book, a poem called Afterward, speaking in the voice of a man painter, Gluck offers an oblique account of her own art. I felt the desert stretching ahead, stretching, it now seems, on all sides, shifting as I speak, so that I was constantly face to face with blankness, that stepchild of the sublime, which, it turns out, has been both my subject and my medium. it would feel like an impertinence in the presence of this noble austerity to list the comet stream of prizes won by Louise Gluck, a former poet laureate of the United States. You can look all that up on Wikipedia. Never mind that now. Listen to the rare voice of poetry itself. Louise Gluck.
Thank you. How is this? Is it functioning? It could be better. It's wobbly. It's insecure. It's going to hurt me. Is this all right? I'm going to read poems from my new book. The book takes its structure from an extended monologue spoken by the voice that Rosanna just inhabited, the voice of Afterward, a painter who is unable to write. And it took a long time to put the book together. I'm not going to read parts of that monologue, even though it's central to the book. In the folds between the sections of that long speech are parables, allegories, little prose poems, and I will read from those tonight and leave you to imagine the central structure around which they're formed. Parable. First, divesting ourselves of worldly goods, as St. Francis teaches, in order that our souls not be distracted by gain and loss, and in order also that our bodies be free to move easily at the mountain passes. We had then to discuss whither or where we might travel, with the second question being, should we have a purpose? Against which many of us argued fiercely that such purpose corresponded to worldly goods, meaning a limitation or constriction, whereas others said it was by this word we were consecrated, pilgrims rather than wanderers. In our minds, the word translated as a dream, a something sought, so that by concentrating we might see it glimmering among the stones and not pass blindly by. Each further issue we debated equally fully, the arguments going back and forth so that we grew, some said, less flexible and more resigned, like soldiers in a useless war. And snow fell upon us, and wind blew, which in time abated. Where the snow had been, many flowers appeared, and where the stars had shone, the sun rose over the tree line, so that we had shadows again. Many times this happened. Also rain, also flooding sometimes, also avalanches in which some of us were lost. And periodically we would seem to have achieved an agreement, our canteens hoisted upon our shoulders. But always that moment passed. So, after many years, we were still at that first stage, still preparing to begin a journey, but we were changed nevertheless. We could see this in one another. We had changed, although we never moved, and one said, "Ah, behold how we have aged, traveling from day to night only, neither forward nor sideward." And this seemed in a strange way miraculous. And those who believed we should have a purpose believed this was the purpose, and those who felt we must remain free in order to encounter truth felt it had been revealed. You need to know one thing in this next poem. The word nay appears twice, and it's spelled two different ways. Nay, N-A-Y, and nay, what a horse, illuminating gesture, what a horse says. It's in sections. An adventure, 1. It came to me one night as I was falling asleep that I had finished with those amorous adventures to which I had long been a slave. Finished with love, my heart murmured, to which I responded that many profound discoveries awaited us, hoping at the same time I would not be asked to name them, for I could not name them. But the belief that they existed, surely this counted for something. 2. The next night brought the same thought, this time concerning poetry. And in the nights that followed, various other passions and sensations were in the same way set aside forever. And each night my heart protested its future like a small child being deprived of a favorite toy. But these farewells, I said, are the way of things. And once more I alluded to the vast territory opening to us with each valediction. And with that phrase, I became a glorious knight riding into the setting sun, and my heart became the steed underneath me. 3. I was, you will understand, entering the kingdom of death. Though why this landscape was so conventional, I could not say. Here, too, the days were very long, while the years were very short. The sun sank over the far mountain. The stars shone, the moon waxed and waned. Soon faces from the past appeared to me. My mother and father, my infant sister, they had not, it seemed, finished what they had to say, though now I could hear them because my heart was still. 4. At this point I attained the precipice, but the trail did not, I saw, descend on the other side. Rather, having flattened out, it continued at this altitude as far as the eye could see, though gradually the mountain that supported it completely dissolved, so that I found myself riding steadily through the air. All around the dead were cheering me on, the joy of finding them obliterated by the task of responding to them. 5. As we had all been flesh together, now we were mist. As we had been before objects with shadows, now we were substance without form, like evaporated chemicals. Nay, nay, said my heart, or perhaps, nay, nay. It was hard to know. 6. Here the vision ended. I was in my bed, the morning sun contentedly rising, the feather comforter mounded in white drifts over my lower body. You had been with me. There was a dent in the second pillowcase. We had escaped from death. Or was this the view from the precipice? Aboriginal landscape. You're stepping on your father, my mother said. And indeed, I was standing exactly in the center of a bed of grass, mown so neatly it could have been my father's grave, although there was no stone saying so. "You're stepping on your father," she repeated, louder this time, which began to be strange to me since she was dead herself. Even the doctor had admitted it. I moved slightly to the side to where my father ended and my mother began. The cemetery was silent. Wind blew through the trees. I could hear very faintly sounds of weeping several rows away, and beyond that, a dog wailing. At length, these sounds abated. It crossed my mind. I had no memory of being driven here to what now seemed a cemetery, though it could have been a cemetery in my mind only. Perhaps it was a park, or if not a park, a garden or bower, perfumed, I now realized, with the scent of roses, douceur de vivre filling the air, the sweetness of living, as the saying goes. At some point, it occurred to me I was alone. Where had the others gone? My cousins and sister, Caitlin and Abigail. By now the light was fading. Where was the car waiting to take us home? I then began seeking for some alternative. I felt an impatience growing in me, approaching, I would say, anxiety. Finally, in the distance, I made out a small train, stopped, it seemed, behind some foliage, the conductor lingering against a door frame, smoking a cigarette. "Do not forget me," I cried, running now over many plots, many mothers and fathers. "Do not forget me," I cried when at last I reached him. "Madam," he said, pointing to the tracks, "surely you realize this is the end. The tracks do not go further." His words were harsh, and yet his eyes were kind. This encouraged me to press my case harder. "But they go back," I said, and I remarked their sturdiness as though they had many such returns ahead of them. "You know," he said, "our work is difficult. We confront much sorrow and disappointment." He gazed at me with increasing frankness. "I was like you once," he added, "in love with turbulence." Now I spoke as to an old friend. "What of you?" I said, since he was free to leave. "Have you no wish to go home, to see the city again?" "This is my home," he said. The city is where I disappear." Utopia. "When the train stops," the woman said, "you must get on it." "But how will I know," the child asked, "it is the right train?" "It will be the right train," said the woman, "because it is the right time." A train approached the station. Clouds of grayish smoke streamed from the chimney. "How terrified I am," the child thinks, clutching the yellow tulip she will give to her grandmother. Her hair has been tightly braided to withstand the journey. Then, without a word, she gets on the train, from which a strange sound comes, not in a language like the one she speaks, something more like a moan or a cry. It's a prose poem of which there are many in this book, and I owe them to Catherine Davis. Thank you. The horse and rider. Once there was a horse, and on the horse there was a rider. How handsome they looked in the autumn sunlight approaching a strange city. People thronged the streets or called from the high windows. Old women sat among flower pots. But when you looked about for another horse or another rider, you looked in vain. "My friend," said the animal, "why not abandon me? Alone you can find your way here." "But to abandon you," said the other, "would be to leave a part of myself behind. And how can I do that when I do not know which part you are?" A foreshortened journey. I found the stairs somewhat more difficult than I had expected, and so I sat down, so to speak, in the middle of the journey. Because there was a large window opposite the railing, I was able to entertain myself with the little dramas and comedies of the street outside, though no one I knew passed by, no one, certainly, who could have assisted me. Nor were the stairs themselves in use as far as I could see. "You must get up, my lad," I told myself. Since this seemed suddenly impossible, I did the next best thing. I prepared to sleep, my head and arms on the stair above, my body crouched below. Sometime after this, a little girl appeared at the top of the staircase, holding the hand of an elderly woman. "Grandmother," cried the little girl, "there is a dead man on the staircase." "We must let him sleep," said the grandmother. "We must walk quietly by. He is at that point in life at which neither returning to the beginning nor advancing to the end seems bearable. Therefore, he has decided to stop here in the midst of things, though this makes him an obstacle to others such as ourselves. But we must not give up hope. In my own life," she continued, "there was such a time, though that was long ago." And here she let her granddaughter walk in front of her so they could pass me without disturbing me. I would have liked to hear the whole of her story, since she seemed, as she passed by, a vigorous woman, ready to take pleasure in life and at the same time forthright without illusions. But soon their voices faded into whispers, or they were far away. "Will we see him when we return?" the child murmured. "He will be long gone by then," said her grandmother. "He will have finished climbing up or down, as the case may be." "Then I will say goodbye now," said the little girl. And she knelt below me, chanting a prayer I recognized as the Hebrew prayer for the dead. "Sir," she whispered, "my grandmother tells me you are not dead, but I thought perhaps this would soothe you in your terrors, and I will not be here to sing it at the right time. When you hear this again," she said, "perhaps the words will be less intimidating if you remember how you first heard them in the voice of a little girl." I'll read two more poems. The first is in sections, 5 sections. A Summer Garden. 1. Several weeks ago, I discovered a photograph of my mother sitting in the sun, her face flushed as with achievement or triumph. The sun was shining. The dogs were sleeping at her feet, where time was also sleeping, calm and unmoving as in all photographs. I wiped the dust from my mother's face. Indeed, dust covered everything. It seemed to me the persistent haze of nostalgia that protects all relics of childhood. In the background, an assortment of park furniture, trees, and shrubbery. The sun moved lower in the sky, the shadows lengthened and darkened. The more dust I removed, the more these shadows grew. Summer arrived. The children leaned over the rose border, their shadows merging with the shadows of the roses. A word came into my head, referring to this shifting and changing, these erasures that were now obvious. It appeared and as quickly vanished. Was it blindness or darkness, peril, confusion? Summer arrived, then autumn. The leaves turning, the children bright spots in a mash of bronze and sienna. 2. When I had recovered somewhat from these events, I replaced the photograph as I had found it between the pages of an ancient paperback, many parts of which had been annotated in the margins, sometimes in words, but more often in spirited questions and exclamations, meaning, I agree, or I'm unsure, puzzled. The ink was faded. Here and there, I couldn't tell what thoughts occurred to the reader, but through the blotches I could sense urgency as though tears had fallen. I held the book a while. It was Death in Venice in translation. I had noted the page in case, as Freud believes, nothing is an accident. Thus, the little photograph was buried again, as the past is buried in the future. In the margin, there were 2 words linked by an arrow, sterility, and down the page, oblivion. And it seemed to him the pale and lovely summoner out there smiled at him and beckoned. 3. How quiet the garden is. No breeze ruffles the cornelian cherry. Summer has come. How quiet it is now that life has triumphed. The rough pillars of the sycamores support the immobile shelves of the foliage, the lawn beneath lush, iridescent, and in the middle of the sky, the immodest God. Things are, he says. They are, they do not change. Response does not change. How hushed it is. The stage as well as the audience, it seems, breathing is an intrusion. He must be very close. The grass is shadowless. How quiet it is. How silent, like an afternoon in Pompeii. 4. Mother died last night. Mother who never dies. Winter was in the air, many months away, but in the air nevertheless. It was the 10th of May. Hyacinth and apple blossom bloomed in the back garden. We could hear Maria singing songs from Czechoslovakia. How alone I am. Songs of that kind. How alone I am, no mother, no father. My brain seems so empty without them. Aromas drifted out of the earth. The dishes were in the sink, rinsed but not stacked. Under the full moon, Maria was folding the washing. The stiff sheets became dry white rectangles of moonlight. How alone I am, but in music, my desolation is my rejoicing. It was the 10th of May, as it had been the 9th, the 8th. Mother slept in her bed, her arms outstretched, her head balanced between them. 5. Beatrice took the children to the park in Cedarhurst. The sun was shining. Airplanes passed back and forth overhead, peaceful because the war was over. It was the world of her imagination. True and false were of no importance. Freshly polished and glittering, that was the world. Dust had not yet erupted on the surface of things. The planes passed back and forth, bound for Rome and Paris. You couldn't get there unless you flew over the park. Everything must pass through. Nothing can stop. The children held hands, leaning to smell the roses. They were 5 and 7. Infinite, infinite. That was her perception of time. She sat on a bench somewhat hidden by oak trees. Far away, fear approached and departed. From the train station came the sound it made. The sky was pink and orange, older because the day was over. There was no wind. The summer day cast oak-shaped shadows on the green grass. And the last poem, a work of fiction. As I turned over the last page after many nights, a wave of sorrow enveloped me. Where had they all gone, these people who had seemed so real? To distract myself, I walked out into the night. Instinctively, I lit a cigarette. In the dark, the cigarette glowed like a fire lit by a survivor. But who would see this light, this small dot among the infinite stars? I stood a while in the dark, the cigarette glowing and growing small, each breath patiently destroying me. How small it was, how brief, 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 but inside me now, which the stars could never be. Thank you.